The first thing I remember is the taste of electricity. It was a sharp, metallic poison on my tongue, and then a violent jolt threw me against the inside of my own skull. I took a breath that was not a breath at all, but a ragged tear of air through lungs that felt like old paper. My eyes snapped open to a room that was shivering in and out of focus. A single light overhead pulsed weakly, casting long shadows that writhed on the cracked tile floor. There was a low fire burning in a metal barrel in the corner, and it filled the air with the smell of scorched plastic and something else, something sick. For a moment, I felt a memory that wasn't mine, a phantom limb of a life before this one. I could hear sirens screaming until they became one continuous note, and I could feel the grit of ash on my teeth while the sky turned the color of a day-old bruise. The memory was hot and fast, and it ended with the sound of glass breaking everywhere at once. Then it was gone, leaving only the throbbing in my head in the cold room. A woman was there. She moved from the shadows near the fire, her steps quiet on the floor. Her face was thin, and her dark eyes were wide with a look that was part fear and part something else I did not understand. She wore faded medical scrubs, and her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She stopped a few feet from the bed I was lying in and stared at me. Her hands were clasped together at her chest as if she was praying. "Dr. Parrish?" she whispered. The name meant nothing. It was a sound in the air, hollow and foreign. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness slammed me back into the thin mattress. My body was a stranger to me, a collection of weak limbs and aching joints. My mind was a barren landscape with no roads, no signs, no history. There was only the present moment and the terror that came with it. "You're awake," she said, her voice trembling. "Oh God, you're awake." She knelt beside the bed, her face close to mine. I could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the fine lines of worry on her forehead. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched my arm. Her fingers were cold. "We thought we lost you," she said. 3 months. We've kept the generator running just for you." Another figure stepped out from the deeper shadows behind her. This one was a man, large and thick with a heavy brow and a face that was set in a permanent scowl. He wore a flannel shirt over a stained t-shirt, and his hand rested on a large knife sheathed at his belt. He did not look at me with hope. He looked at me like I was a problem he was about to solve. "He's awake," the woman said, looking over her shoulder at the big man. "Cade, he's awake. It's a miracle." The man Cade just grunted. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on something on my wrist. I followed his gaze and saw a plastic band clipped around my thin arm. On it was a logo, some kind of stylized bird, and a name, Dr. J. Parrish. My eyes flicked back to the woman. She was smiling now, a fragile, desperate expression. "You're a doctor," she said, as if reminding me. "From the Brilliant lab. You were working on the antigen. You have to remember." I searched the empty space in my head for any of those words, for antigen or Brilliant or lab, but found nothing. There was only a profound and terrifying silence. My body, however, reacted on its own. It catalogued the room, noted the 2 exits, assessed the woman as a non-threat and the man Cade as a significant one. The cold, logical part of my brain I did not know I had was already formulating a plan for survival. Cade spoke, his voice a low gravel. "Ask him what happened. Ask him why his company did this to us." The woman, Yari, shook her head. "He was injured in the blast, Cade, the one that took down the facility. We found him on the highway. He needs time." She turned back to me, her eyes pleading. "Doctor, please. We need you. We're running out of everything. Food, medicine, hope." She pulled something from my belongings on the small table beside the bed. It was a worn leather wallet. She opened it and showed me a photograph inside. A smiling woman, 2 small children, a sunny day. They were strangers. Their faces meant nothing to me, but I saw the reflection of my own loss in Yari's eyes as she looked at it. She lost a family too. I knew it without being told. This was my only way out. This was my shield. I had to take the role she was giving me. I swallowed, my throat dry and raw. "The blast," I said, my own voice sounding unfamiliar. "It took most of it. My memory." Yari's face fell, but only for a second before the hope flooded back in. But not everything. You must remember something. A cure. A safe place. There was a sanctuary, I said, the words coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. A facility. For containment. For survival. I latched onto the name that floated up from the dark water of my mind. Kestrel 9. The name seemed to satisfy her. It was a key. Cade, however, was unmoved. He stepped forward until he loomed over the bed. Kestrel 9, he repeated, his voice full of disbelief. A corporate fairy tale. He's lying. He's one of them. A suit. He is our only chance, Yari shot back, rising to her feet to stand between us. She was small, but her voice was fierce. He is the only one who can lead us out of this. Just then, the wind outside changed. It was a subtle shift, a different tone in its constant howl against the hospital's broken windows. A strange amber light began to filter into the room, painting the peeling walls in a sickly glow. A few of the other survivors, who had been watching us from the far side of the room, began to stir with alarm. The wind, one of them said, his voice tight with panic. It's coming from the east, from the town. Panic spread through the small group like a contagion. They knew what that color meant. A spore cloud. The air itself was about to become poison. Their fragile haven was turning into a tomb. In that moment of chaos, my instincts took over completely. I sat up straight, the dizziness gone, replaced by a cold and absolute clarity. "Everyone, listen to me," I barked. My voice cut through the rising fear with an authority that surprised even myself. They all turned to look at me, their faces pale in the amber light. "Panic is a luxury we don't have. We are leaving. Now." I swung my legs over the side of the bed. I was weak, but my mind was sharp. "Yari, medical supplies only. Anything heavy gets left behind. Cade, I need you to get the water containers, every last one. We need a map, a topographical map of the county." Someone scrambled to find one and spread it on a dusty table. I stood over it, my finger tracing a path through the desert terrain with a confidence I did not feel. I pointed to a location deep in the western range. "Here," I said. "This is Kestrel 9. We move west, keeping the wind at our backs. We travel at night when the air is cooler and the spores are less active." They stared at me, their fear slowly being replaced by a fragile obedience. Yari looked at me with pure adoration. Cade watched with narrowed, hateful eyes, but even he did not argue. He went to gather the water. I had given them a plan. I had given them a destination. I had accepted the lie and made it real. I looked at the small line of survivors grabbing their meager belongings, my flock. Then I looked out the window at the amber haze creeping across the horizon, a poisonous wave I had just promised to lead them through. The first man came out of the rocks with a pipe in his hand, and the wind snatched his scream away. He was one of us an hour ago, a quiet man named Marcus, but now his eyes were wide and white, and he looked straight through me. Two more shambled out behind him, their faces contorted in a mask of terror that drove them to kill. I didn't think, I just moved. I sidestepped the wild swing of the pipe and drove my shoulder into the man's chest, taking him to the hard red dirt of the canyon floor. He was weak, his body already betraying him. His hands clawed at my face and his breath was a wet rattle. I grabbed his wrist and twisted, and the snap of bone was a loud, clean sound in the sudden quiet. A second man lunged and I kicked out, my boot connecting with his knee. He went down howling. Before the third could reach me, Cade was there, bringing the butt of his rifle down on the man's skull with a sound like a melon splitting. The fight was over in 10 seconds. There was no victory in it, just the grim business of survival. My leg burned with a sharp, sudden fire, and I looked down to see a piece of rusted metal, shrapnel from some old wreck, sticking out of my calf. The group watched me with a kind of reverence that made my skin crawl. They saw a hero who had moved with impossible speed, a doctor who understood violence. Cade just looked at me with that familiar, cold certainty. Later, as the sun dipped below the canyon rim, Yari knelt before me with her medical kit. Her fingers were gentle as she cleaned the wound around the metal shard. "Hold still, doctor," she murmured, her focus absolute. She pulled the jagged piece of metal from my flesh with a pair of tweezers, and I hissed through my teeth. She held it up in the failing light, turning it over. It wasn't just rusted scrap. It was thick, layered, and had a distinctive curve. "This is from a ballistics plate," she said, her voice quiet. "From a military vest." I had no answer for that, so I said nothing. Across the small fire, Cade watched us, his eyes missing nothing. Yari saw a protector who had been wounded. Cade saw a man who knew how to break bones, and he knew this wasn't my first time killing. That night, she came to my side as I kept watch. The others were wrapped in thin blankets, a small circle of fitful sleep. She sat beside me and redressed the bandage on my leg. The warmth from her hands seeped through the cloth. "I need you to know," she began, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "I need you to understand why I believe in you." She told me about her husband, David, and her little girl, Maya. She described the first hours of the collapse at the hospital, the screaming and the chaos, how the science she had built her life on failed in a single afternoon. She had watched them both die, not from the infection but from the panic, trampled by a crowd trying to flee. "When I found you," she said, her dark eyes locked on mine, "you had an ID card. But you also had a wallet. There was a picture inside, a woman and a little girl. I thought they were your family." A cold knot formed in my stomach. I had no memory of a wallet, of a family. "It felt like a sign," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "That you had lost someone too. That you understood. That saving us was how you would make it mean something. You are all I have left to believe in, Jake." She placed her hand on my arm, and the weight of it was heavier than a mountain. Her faith was a cage being built around me, bar by bar, and I was helping her construct it. The lie had never felt so real, or so cruel. Our water ran out 2 days later. The desert stretched before us, a pale, heat-shimmered expanse. Cade suggested we follow a dry riverbed, arguing it was the most direct route to a landmark on our map. It was a subtle challenge, a test of my leadership. The logic felt wrong, a deep instinct I couldn't explain telling me it was a trap. A memory flickered behind my eyes, a map overlay glowing on a screen, convoy routes highlighted in green. "No," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Convoys stick to high ground, better sightlines. We follow that ridge." I pointed to a low rise to the west. Cade argued, but Yari sided with me, and so the group followed. An hour later, we found it. A large, brilliant transport truck lay on its side, white paint peeling under the brutal sun. The back was full of sealed water canisters and boxes of MREs. We had also found a locked data puck, a small, heavy square of black metal. The survivors celebrated, their relief echoing off the rocks. They saw another miracle from the brilliant doctor. I didn't feel like a doctor. I felt like a soldier who had just read the terrain correctly. My eyes scanned the area, and they stopped on the ridge we had just left. Figures stood there, silhouetted against the sky. They were too far to see clearly, but they were watching us. They wore strange masks and carried long poles. One of them raised a hand, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. They wore masks stylized with the curving, three-pronged sigil of brilliant dynamics. I felt a dread that was old and familiar. They were not watching us like we were prey. They were watching us like I was a messiah they had been waiting for. The Spore Prophets, as someone nervously named them, began to follow us. They never got close, just a persistent presence on the horizon. They left things for us to find. A dead coyote arranged in a spiral. A doll's head impaled on a stick, its face painted with the brilliant sigil. The psychological pressure was immense, and the group's nerves began to shred. One of the survivors, a man named Eli, finally snapped. He stood before me, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. "They're hurting us," he yelled, Cade standing a few feet behind him, a silent pillar of support. "You led us right to them. What kind of doctor are you?" I needed to crush this before it spread. The old, cold part of my mind took over, the part that calculated risks and managed assets. When we doled out the water that evening, I gave Eli the smallest ration, just enough to survive, but not enough to feel secure. He stared at the bottle in his hand, then at me, his defiance collapsing into fear. The others saw it and looked away. Yari pulled me aside, her face tight with anger. "What was that? You're punishing him." "I'm maintaining discipline." "That's what a soldier would say," she countered, her voice low and dangerous. "Not a healer." The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them, chillingly familiar. Sentiment is a liability. A flash of memory hit me so hard I staggered. I was screaming into a radio, the air thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. Sacrifice the asset, complete the mission. The group was now quiet, obedient. But when I looked at Yari, I no longer saw faith in her eyes. I saw the first flicker of judgment, and it was more terrifying than any enemy. We were cornered in a derelict gas station a day later, the prophets closing in from 3 sides. Their guttural chanting drifted on the wind, a promise of a slow, agonizing death. Our only way out was a dark, narrow sewer culvert at the back of the property. It was a suicide run. We'd be exposed for a full minute crossing the open ground to reach it. The tactical part of my brain offered a solution, simple and brutal. I grabbed Eli, the man I had disciplined. Cade started to move, but I was faster. I pushed a spare fuel can into Eli's hands. "I need a diversion," I told him, my voice calm and steady. "Go to the front pumps, make a lot of noise. We'll wait for you at the culvert entrance. I promise." He looked at me, desperate to believe, and nodded. He ran. The moment he was out of sight and the prophet's chanting shifted toward his position, I turned to the others. "Now. Go." Yari stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You're not waiting for him." "He was an acceptable loss," I said, the words tasting like ash. A man's scream, short and terrible, cut through the air from the front of the station. At that exact moment, the dam in my mind broke. It wasn't a flash, it was a flood. I saw everything. The clean, sterile halls of the proving ground. The name on my office door. Jacoby Parrish, Chief of Site Security. Arguing with scientists, championing the Kestrel 9 protocol. The alarms. The chaos of the breach. Running for the exit and sealing the blast doors behind me, trapping everyone inside. The explosion that threw me against a wall, the shrapnel tearing into my temple. I was not a doctor who had survived. I was the architect who had locked the tomb and tried to run. We made it into the stinking darkness of the culvert. Safely away for the moment, the group huddled, their breathing ragged. Then they turned on me. Yari stood before me, her face a ruin of betrayal. "The military plate," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "The way you fight, the way you talk. That man's scream. Who are you?" Cade stepped beside her, his rifle held loosely but ready. I didn't deny it. The energy to lie was gone, burned away by the horror of my own memory. I told them everything. My name was Jacoby Parrish. I was head of security. I designed the protocol that killed their families. I told them what Kestrel 9 was, not a sanctuary. It was a furnace, a terminal containment facility of my own design, built to incinerate everything inside. When I was done, I sagged against the curved concrete wall, the weight of who I was crushing me. "You should kill me," I whispered. There was no sound but the wind whistling at the mouth of the tunnel. And then another sound began. It was faint at first, but it was growing steadily closer. The rhythmic, guttural chanting of the spore prophets. "Good," Cade said, his voice a low rumble in the concrete pipe. "Now you're useful." He held the rifle leveled at my chest, his expression unreadable in the gloom, but his words were not a threat, they were a proposal. The chanting of the prophets grew louder outside, a rhythmic pulse of promised violence against the thin concrete walls of our hiding place. My confession hung in the air between us, the truth of Kestrel 9, of my name, of the apocalypse I had designed. I expected a bullet. Instead, Cade saw an asset. "You built the trap," he said, ignoring the horrified stares of the others. "You can lead them into it. All of them." The plan formed in my mind with a chilling, familiar clarity, a tactical problem with a brutal solution. I was no longer Jake the Savior. I was Parrish, the security chief. I would lead the Prophets to Kestrel 9. I would get them inside the main chamber and use my access to manually trigger a lockdown, sealing the interior blast doors to trap them. My flock would be safe in the antechamber while the Prophets starved or turned on each other in the concrete box I had built. It was a cold, pragmatic plan, and as I explained it, I felt the monster I had been reawakening inside me. An unholy alliance was formed in that stinking culvert. Cade held the gun to my back as we moved, not as a threat, but as a reminder of my new role as a tool. Yari walked beside me, her face set like stone, her dark eyes clear and empty of the faith that had sustained her. She no longer looked at me for hope. She watched me with the bitter focus of a prosecutor observing the condemned. I was leading them once more, not to a promised salvation, but into the mouth of the tomb I had built for the world. We reached Kestrel 9 at dusk. It was a monolithic concrete bunker sunk into the desert floor, a single, massive steel door, its only visible feature. It looked exactly as it did in the blueprints stored in my memory, a monument to utilitarian death. The Prophets were close behind, their chanting a constant pressure on our backs. They saw the bunker, saw the brilliant sigil etched above the door, and their excitement became a fevered roar. They thought they were chasing us to their holy land. I pressed my palm to the biometric scanner and the keycard to the slot below it. For a long second, there was only silence. Then a deep grinding sound echoed from within the structure, and the massive outer door began to slide open. We rushed inside, into a large, sterile chamber with white walls and a polished concrete floor, lit by cold fluorescent panels. The plan failed immediately. The Prophets were too fast, their desperation giving them a speed we had not accounted for. They swarmed into the main chamber with us, a wave of crude weapons and enraged yells. I ran for the security panel on the far wall, my hand outstretched to slam the lockdown button for the interior door. Before I could reach it, a calm, synthesized female voice echoed from hidden speakers. Biometric signature confirmed. Welcome, Chief Parrish. Kestrel protocol initiated. Bioincineration cycle commences in T-10 minutes. Colossal blast doors began to seal the main entrance behind the last of the charging Prophets, shutting with a sound of final, metallic thunder. We were all trapped inside. 10 minutes. The calm voice had given us 10 minutes to live. As the first of the Prophets lunged, a blade of sharpened metal flashing in his hand, my final memory clicked into place. I remembered the small, hardened control room adjacent to this chamber. I remembered the precise location of the override I had designed for the incineration cycle, and I remembered the terrible, impossible path to reach it. The chamber erupted into chaos. Cade's rifle cracked, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. A Prophet went down, but 3 more took his place. The 10-minute countdown appeared in red digits on the security panel. The fight was a pointless spasm of violence before the fire came for us all. "The control room!" I screamed over the noise, pointing to a thick steel door I knew was rated to withstand the incineration. "Get in there!" Gas nozzles hissed from the ceiling, a prelude to the chemical accelerant that would flood the room. I shoved Yari towards the door, then Cade, then the few others who were still on their feet. The override. A security chief's manual fail-safe. I designed in case a high-value asset was trapped by mistake, was not inside the control room. It was on the outside, accessible only through a maintenance conduit that would be flash-cooked with everything else in this chamber. It was a final, perfect security measure. The system could not be disabled from a place of safety. My mind, the cold, utilitarian instrument that had caused all this, made its final calculation. I pushed Yari through the doorway of the control room. She looked back at me, her face streaked with grime and tears, and in her eyes I saw she finally understood everything. "The mission is all that matters," I told her, and the horror in my own eyes must have shown her that I finally understood it too. I slammed the meter-thick door shut and spun the locking wheel on the outside, sealing them in. The red timer on the wall read 2 minutes. I turned and fought my way through the swirling, brutal melee, my only goal, the the small hidden panel for the maintenance conduit on the far wall. A prophet swung a pipe at my head, and I blocked it with my forearm, feeling the bone crunch. I drove my fist into his throat and scrambled past him. I tore the panel open and crawled into the narrow metal shaft as the timer reached 0. A silent roar of white heat filled the chamber below me. The metal of the conduit glowed red, then brighter, and the air burned in my lungs. My skin felt like it was peeling away from my bones, but I forced my hands forward, toward the override valve I could just make out in the searing light. Through the grate below, I could see the steel door to the control room, a dark, solid shape in the impossible glare. Safe. The calculation was complete. My hands found the wheel and I turned,